Google is now only releasing Android source code twice a year. Android is open source. Google does a lot of their stuff like this too, like the Chromium browser. There's like a very basic source code that is available for anyone. And then Google adds on to that to make the Android for like pixels and stuff. But also like Samsung and LG and all these other companies, they add on to it and they make their own version. And so that's why everybody has kind of a little bit slightly different, but at the same time, they're all very similar. So historically, Google has been releasing the source code for nearly every new version of Android. And that's typically within a day or two of the Pixel getting updates. However, starting this year, Google will now only be releasing the source code twice a year. Google has actually been undergoing a lot of changes like this and has slowly been becoming less and less open source. It really kicked off last year when they decided. So I mentioned they published the source code. Well, they used to specifically publish the Pixel source code. However, last year, Google said, well, we're not going to publish this anymore. We're going to publish a version that's basically kind of like a virtual machine. And that way developers can still make their apps. But the actual OEMs, like again, Graphene and Calyx, they have to reverse engineer it. And it can take months in some cases to do that. The one saving grace is that Google has been releasing monthly security updates, but I believe only certain people are privy to that. I think there's a program that you have to opt into, and they're very protective of who they let into that program. This is just kind of another step in that trend where Google is kind of rolling this stuff back. They used to release quarterly updates, and now they're only going to release two. So they're basically cutting it in half, twice a year.
I'm a lot more worried about Google's future intentions with the open source project rather than at least this specific action, primarily because at the end of the day, the security updates are what really matters for vast majority of users. Then again, though, I'm not saying the problem will end there. What if they, for example, continue these delays? What if they, for example, decide to even close down the Android open source project entirely? Google essentially owns Android, regardless of it being open source or not. And the fact that we're so reliant on one company proves to show that it's in fact inherently quite dangerous. There is a clear trend here, and it's quite disturbing. And even if like it's not the end of the world that this happened, it's still like a concern that you should definitely monitor in the future.
Even people who like aren't really privacy enthusiasts, people who aren't like, oh, I use Graphene because it's super secure and super private. A lot of people pick Android over iOS because it's open, because they can sideload, because they can modify it and tinker and do things that you just can't do on iOS. And you kind of have to wonder at that point, if they go fully closed source, like what's really their selling point? It's just a different UI and maybe a little bit cheaper than an iPhone, but it kind of loses a lot of the selling points the more that they close it down and the more, they're cracking down on side loading and they're trying to make it more difficult. Google has built such a passionate community of enthusiasts who like to have a device they can tinker with. And I feel like they're really going to burn bridges the more they step away from that.